Buenos días, tardes, good afternoon. This will be in English, and thank you very much for being here. On behalf of the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Black American Studies, I welcome you to this discussion on Mexico City, a novel, and the paths of architecture. And we have an important guest today. Pedro Ángel Palou is a prolific writer, novelist, essayist, and critic. He's the author of more than 50 books and several award-winning novels. Particularly, he's delved into the genre of historical novels. That's what he's most known for. His doctorate comes from social sciences, and he has studied literature also from sociological perspective and cultural studies perspective. He is a professor now at Tufts University, but he has also had manifold roles in connection with culture. He was the Minister of Culture of the state of Puebla in Mexico, the rector of the University of the Americas, and a guest researcher in contemporary studies at the University of Paris-Descartes, as well as a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, where he was also a writer in residence. He has been a member of the National Artists Network and the National Research Network of Mexico, and he holds 2 doctorates honoris causa from UNESCO and also the Ricardo Palma University in Peru. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship for fiction writing. He's an anchorman on public TV, Canal 22, where we saw his great series on food and literature. And he's the Fletcher Professor of Oratory of Romance Languages at Tufts University, and a longtime colleague and friend. Juan Miró, our colleague here at UT Austin, was born in Barcelona and obtained his professional degree at the Escuela de Arquitectura of the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. He earned a Fulbright scholarship to complete a post-professional master's at Yale, and is a professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, and also a renowned architect. He teaches and researches on construction, architectural, and particularly urban design. He's very well known for his scholarship on Mexican architecture and his work on Mexico City. And he's also a principal at the Miró Rivera Architects, and which is an internationally recognized architectural practice that has won over 70 design awards. In 2011, he was elevated to the College of Fellows of the American Institute of Architects for his contributions to society as a designer and educator. And I am Adela Pineda. I forgot to tell you my name. I am a professor of literature and culture and the director of Lilas here at UT. So the way we're going to proceed is we are going to talk about this recently published novel. It was published in Spanish in Mexico and has had wide reception. It's called Mexico, just that. Mexico, the novel. So we don't know what's more important, if Mexico or the novel. So Pedro, thank you so much and welcome. We want this to be a conversation, so if you get more hungry and you need more food, please don't hesitate and serve yourself, okay? So thank you.
Thank you, Adela. Thanks everyone for being here. Gracias, Juan. Thank you. So when Adela and I started thinking on how to proceed for a conversation about a novel with an architect, we thought that maybe if I just explain a little bit about the architecture of the novel, the conception of the novel, because when you write a novel, you have to make a lot of structural decisions that are very, very keen to architecture. And I just want to mention briefly that at some time in my career, I was very, very close to a Mexican architect, Pedro Ramírez Vázquez. He was building an auditorium in Puebla for in the time that I was in public service there. And I went into long conversations with him that served me very well as a novelist, not only because he was creating a huge auditorium. And one of the things that he explained to me while talking about his reconception of the Basilica de Guadalupe in Mexico and the decisions that he had to make. It's a long story, but I'm just going to tell two fascinating moments of that story. He did, as you know, Pedro Ramirez Vázquez did a lot of public architecture in Mexico, but then the 1968 massacre and the Olympic Games came into play, and he didn't have any commissions at the time because his involvement with the Olympic Committee. So he wasn't able to build his only passion. And he went daily with his wife to the basilica that was almost collapsing, the old basilica, trying to think what to do, but with no public commission. At some point he developed his idea of a huge tent with a pole that went into the firm soil for like 29 or 30 meters. That's why it has a big pole, and then there is this tent. And then he went with President Echeverría trying to sell the church. And you wonder why Echeverría wanted to make a church. And Echeverría was almost leaving office. And he got a compromise with Ramirez Vázquez and told him, okay, if you finish before I leave office, and there is the 12th of December when I'm a president there, you will have the money to build the church. And then he had another problem. Once he had money and the idea was to convince the bishops in Mexico of the form of the church. And then there was a very famous leftist bishop from Cuernavaca, Sergio Méndez Arceo, and Sergio stood up and told Pedro Ramirez Vázquez, "Where are the cupulas? There are no cupulas in your church." And Ramirez Vázquez, in a moment of wit, just thinking, what do I have to tell this guy? He said, "Do you remember where and in which context Jesus predicated? In a tent." Mm-hmm. And then Méndez Arceo said, "You won. You will have your basilica." And then, all the decisions in the basilica are technical decisions, are made because of the technical difficulties of the place. He didn't want to build another basilica as the former one that would collapse at some point. And he told me some things that I always think when I write novels, that novels are in service as a building, in service of the characters. A building is in service of the users of the building. And if you can create the technical aspects of an architectural aspects of the structure of a novel where your characters can feel comfortable, then you're in a good shape. If you're not able to build these fundamentals of the construction, then the novel will somehow collapse. So I'm just going to tell three of my biggest and most difficult decisions on the novel while researching for 6 years about Mexico City and thinking for myself that I was just in a doomed enterprise, that I was never going to be able to write a novel about the 500 years of a city. So the first decision was let's say, a linguistic decision. Who's going to narrate a novel that has to be enough involved with the linguistic components of the Spanish of the era, and then evolve for 500 years, being at the same time somehow neutral. So working very closely in terms of dialogue, description, but then created a narrator that is the same third-person narrator that can travelogue the entire novel. So I decided to make parallel research while researching in Mexico City, researching with some of the most important linguistic traditions, and even picking novels that are not very well known in the canon. For example, there's a very interesting novel from Heriberto Frias that it's called Los Piratas del Boulevard, the Pirates of the Boulevard. That it's really the first amazing, funny satire of the Mexican intellectuals at the end of 19th century. But it gives me a lot of nuance in terms of words and phrasing, and the same happens with Tablada a little bit after, and it will be part of the style when we are seeing the gay movement in the 60s in La Zona Rosa, or with the Vampiro de la Zona Rosa, or the so-called literatura de la onda. So it's very difficult because you're crossing a very thin line between being somehow costumbrista and be very fond of how they could have talked, but because you don't have enough linguistic information, you are really using the literature as your framework. So that's the first big decision. And the other one was, because it has to be by nature an episodic novel, it has to cover 500 years, then instead of having protagonists or main characters, you will have 4 families, and those families will be the main characters. There will be a pre-Hispanic family, some Tlacuilos that were before the Spaniards came, were already painting and writing, and that family is the Cuautle family. As you know, some Mexican families, if they were noble of the noble elite, or they were from Tlaxcala and Cholula, they were allowed to keep their last names, because many of the other ones were baptized even with a new last name. So the Cuautles are a family that will be in the novel before 1521, and it will be the archaeologist that will end the novel. There's an internal joke there, because the final character, his name is Leonardo Cuautle Luján, and there is obviously a very famous archaeologist, the son of López Austin, that it's really López Luján, Leonardo López Luján, and works in the Templo Mayor. But my character is from a very different lineage, and it's also gay, so I have to change a little bit the names. Then there is a very rich family that are in the business of mining in Zacatecas and in the center of Mexico. Those are the Santoveña. They're very close to the Inquisition. They allow me to narrate some other aspects of the social life, especially in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. But as many families, they don't know part of their lineage, so they don't know that they have a Cuautle in their blood. They believe that they're like pure Spaniards. I'm not going to spoil some of the things, so that's another family. There's a third family that it's more like a commercial family. They're bakers. They're from Spain, but they're bakers, and they allow me to, the term will be an anachronism, but at some point they will become middle class, but it allows me to narrate many other aspects of social life where you're not in the elite, but you're not a peasant, or you're not a robber, or you're not a banker. So those are the Landero. And then there is a family that comes at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, from Syria, a Jewish family. And I have the luxury of having a friend that has the same last name, and he allowed me to use not only his family story, because I interview him a lot, but also the last name. So that's the Sefami family.
And he's an alumnus of UT.
He's an alumnus of UT
Spanish
here.
department.
Exactly. And he works at UC Irvine. It's a poet and a critic from Mexico City. And obviously a lot of the things that happens to the Sefami in the novel are not the things that happen to his family, but some of the more colorful, like for example, they're starting, it's like 1921, and they are already having kepe bola, but with chipotle sauce, no? Like his family. And they are hearing only Arab and Arab music, but they don't speak to their kids in Sephardi or in Arab, and they want them to only talk in Spanish, as many migrant families, not only in Mexico, but everywhere. So, but I think that the sense of community that the Jewish community has allows me also to narrate some other very important aspects of being a migrant, but at some point becoming somehow wealthy, and also very close to the commercial families and the bakers. And so some of the moments of the novel I can mingle some of the families, but obviously there's no much coincidence. The moment that allows me to really have all the kids of these four families together is 1968. So all of them are in the National University, all of them participate in the Consejo Nacional de Huelga, they go to the manifestations, to the protests, and I have another joke there. This archaeologist, when he was younger than when he worked in the Templo Mayor, had a house in the Portales, and it's called in the novel it's called the Cuartel de la Portales, and it's the house of Carlos Monsiváis, but without Carlos Monsiváis and without the cats. There are no cats, but it's a house. It's the library of Carlos Monsiváis. Everything there is a homage to his idea of recovering the memory of Mexico, not with highbrow manifestations, but with popular culture. So I recreated in that house as a special homage to Carlos, but also it also allows me to have all the four families together in 1960. And the novel ends in 1985 in the earthquake, because it's also a novel about the catastrophic idea of having a city built in a lake. So you will have during the entire novel, earthquakes, inundations, flooding, plagues, epidemics, and all the things that happen in a city. And just to start the conversation with Juan, I will end this part saying that I had a lot of some parts of my personal agenda in this novel that maybe in other of my historical novels I didn't really try to encompass. And here I tried very, very hard to also have a novel, and I know that it's not very sexy to use that term nowadays, but it's also a novel of manners. So you will have, in a strict sense, how they dress, the furniture that they use, the music that they hear, the food that they eat. So it's a novel of minutiae, a lot of minutiae. Trying to obviously put all that minutiae in 600 pages of a manuscript, because you don't have. I know that it's really big, but it could have been like a 1,000 or 2,000 pages novel. But I tried to be very close to the everything of the daily life of the people, and at the same time trying to narrate a long story, a longue durée story, as the historians, Brodel and the historians will say. But I have received many compliments from the readers, saying that one of the things that they really like is that they feel that they are in different parts, in different moments of Mexican, of the city and Mexican history. So it's called Mexico, la novela, and some of my friends told me it's a very ambitious title. Well, it's a very ambitious novel, so why should I be shy saying, for example, Mexico, one novel? No, la novela, no, the novel. So if you're already devoting 6 years of your life trying to make an ambitious novel, well, the title is also ambitious. I didn't want to be shy about the title. So thanks again, Adela, and thanks for the conversation.
Well, I don't know how many. I mean, I know that the book just came out. Has anyone been able to read the novel already? Okay, good. So it's I mean, Adela told me when she invited me, it's like maybe.
I didn't show him the novel.
Yeah, no, and she said maybe you don't need to read it. You just talk about it. No, I say, how can I not read it? So so I read it, and it was a pleasure. Congratulations! It's really a monumental effort. Every time that I was going page by page, I was thinking about what kind of incredible effort it takes to write with the level of minutia, like you said, the daily details, the historical arc, is all there. But the other thing that is there is the city. And I think that it's interesting when you talk about the four families. I think that really, at the end, you can say that the protagonist is the city itself. Yeah. In a beautiful way, because it's the common thread, right? It's where everything happens. Even if it's. This is the other thing that also maybe is ambitious about the title, that it's not Mexico City.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Mexico.
Yeah.
I was recently in Guadalajara, and I think that they have this resignation about being like Mexico City. It's just such a...
Yeah.
It's like a black hole. And it's interesting that the novel about Mexico City is written by someone from Puebla.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that for me as an architect, urban designer, I've been in love with Mexico for many years. I'm from Spain originally, but I've traveled with students. I've been traveling to Mexico with students for 25 years, and I teach a class that has a little bit the same ambition that you have in this novel, which is I teach a class about the history of Mexican architecture and urbanism from pre-Columbian times until the 21st century. I go even past 1985. And I know that it feels like so crazy, because it's a little like with your novel. You feel like you can take one chapter of this novel and you could make a novel in itself, especially with some of the characters and so it's an exercise of finding that common thread that allows you to make sense. Mm-hmm. So when I think about the way you tie everything together in a way, how the city serves as that common ground where all these things happen is just a very, very immense task, because you need to speak with a lot of precision about a lot of things. So when I think about my class and all the characters that are here, I say they're all there. It's like Teotihuacan is there, even if it starts in Tenochtitlan, there's reference to Teotihuacan, which is one of my passions, and then Tenochtitlan, and you have Cortés and his son, and then the friars, and so you go there, and I can say, well, this could be a reference for any kind of history of Mexico, because a class of the history of Mexico, because you're covering really the main aspects of each of the periods that you're covering. In fact, one of the first questions that I had for you, it would be, I know that very, very much I thought the same thing, that this could be 2,000 pages. But the thing that I kept coming to my mind is, what criteria did you choose to select the episodes in the history that you wanted to cover? Because it's very precise, and obviously some of them are very understandable, but obviously you finished with 1968 and the big earthquake of 1985, but there are a lot of choices. Probably you could have gone in many different directions. I wonder if there was a larger list and you reduced it, or did you have more or less these since the beginning, or what was the criteria that you followed to select those moments that you thought that were important to tie everything together?
Yeah, that's a very important question, I think. And on the contrary, there were fewer chapters. And then when I saw the novel is divided in three different books. The first book goes all the way to what the historians call the Pensamiento Criollo, the pre-independence. Then there's a huge part that it's 19th century, that I think that 19th century Mexico and Mexico City has not been so well researched or talked about, because it's like a gray period where you have like the governments of the centralist and federalist, and the work with the United States, then the French intervention, then the Porfiriato. But many things that happened between are not really taken into account. And then obviously the 20th century. So at the beginning, I joke with this a lot, that I didn't want that the novel will cover all the vacations from the school days in Mexico, because all the dates are los puentes, ¿no? Día de la Bandera, Día de la Constitución, ¿no? So you could read the novel each puente, no? Each long weekend with the SEP, no? But obviously some of the dates are very, very obvious and historical. But then I decided, why if I can try to think, and that entails a lot of research, of years that are like 2 or 3 years before the catastrophic event, or 2 or 3 years after what happened. Mm-hmm. So the characters are already suffering the consequences of history. And then there are some other moments, like, for example, the Decena Trágica, the assassination of Madero. It's the only time that there was some kind of war in terms of the revolution in Mexico City. Mexico City didn't experience anything about the revolution. That's why, for example, when Álvaro Obregón became president, Carranza was going to be the president, but Obregón took the city. He made the rich people and some of the foreigners to sweep the streets as a punishment because they didn't feel any violence from the revolution. But then there's these horrible days, and I decided I can tell that story from a very character that it's involved within, or because we have Tablada. Tablada was a very crazy poet that believed that he was Japanese, not Mexican. So he had a Japanese house with Japanese servers, and it was in Coyoacán. The house exists. You can even go and see the Japanese house of Tablada. And Tablada was really afraid because he was very close to the people that were doing the coup. So he just was hidden in the house. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to tell that story from the perspective of Tablada, that doesn't see anything. He talks with Felix Diaz by the phone. He hears the servers talking in Japanese with the embassy about what's happening in the city, but he's in Coyoacán, and at that time Coyoacán was far away from the Ciudadela, no? So it's a kind of internal joke from the novel. The most important moment in terms of the violence of Mexico City, and I, as a narrator, I decided that I'm not gonna tell a first-hand story. I'm gonna tell the story of a literati that it's seeing this same moment with a kimono and almost in a fort. And then at some point he opens a window and he sees a Zapatista, and at that point seeing a Zapatista is like seeing a Latila del Sur, so everything is going to collapse in this moment. No, Mexico is going to be destroyed because the Zapatistas are coming. And then the Zapatistas became the most honest police that Mexico has had in its entire history. They're really well known as very honest, and that's why in Mexico, when that finishes and Carranza was president, we have now a name for robbing in Mexico. It's carrancear. So if a Mexican says, "Ya te carrancearon," it's very similar than when the carrancistas enter into your house and just looted everything for them. So, but I mean, it's just a very concrete example of how you decide. Some of the moments are before the catastrophe. Some of the moments are like 2 or 3 years after what happened. Trying to be more like a history of the sensibilities than a history of the exact moments that we can read in a history book.
Well, it flows very well. One of the things that you haven't said it, but the good thing is that as I was reading the book, I was wondering a lot of things about how the research happened and everything. He has several pages at the end of the book explaining pretty detailed, in a very detailed way, all the people and the books that were helpful for him to write the novel. But you also say something at the beginning that is very clear, that you're saying this is a historic novel. A novel means I can make up things. Yeah. But at the same time, you're doing things that are historically very clearly researched. So the thing that is beautiful about the book is how those two are, woven together in a way that, of course, when you are an architect and you hear him talking about certain architects, I know who they are, but someone that may not know our architecture, they don't know if that's a fictional character or a real character. And this happens to me in other areas, probably, that there's some people that I don't know for sure if it's your imagination and I think it's very, very well done the way all these well-known characters in some cases appear in the novel in a very natural way, or the way Frida and Diego appear, or the one you mentioned, Pedro Ángel Palou, for example. Most people may not know him. You know, to me, is one of the most important Mexican architects that I think it needs to be recognized more outside outside Mexico. But I think that the way you are able to bring those characters in ways that is very natural for the novel side of the novel, but it's at the same time, especially when when you're reading a novel and all the time they go into an area that you are particularly knowledgeable about. And then you always wonder, oh, let's see if they say something. And you don't say anything that is like, the chirria, no? That something that it feels like, okay, here they went a little. Like, I remember reading a book years ago of someone arriving to Machu Picchu by car. And I said, well, this guy didn't do
any research.
It's the worst. I mean, I stopped reading because this guy is just like useless. He hasn't even made 20 minutes of checking that you cannot get to Machu Picchu by car. And so in this case, I have to say that from the process of the city, as I said, there's a lot about the city. And I think it's beautiful to see how the presence of the city is basically uncovered in ways that are very natural to the way the novel works. I mean, there's the infrastructure challenges of the lake, like you said. There's the epidemic and the problems that come from not having enough protection for these epidemics to be devastating. But the way you can take it all the way to making reference to Gerritz and Barragán and the Ciudad Satélite and what it meant for Mexico when it expanded. So you basically cover a lot of the moments. I mean, and it's very well covered from the point of view of the reading of someone that is particularly keen in learning about those aspects of how the city becomes the protagonist. I think that there is and when you think about how it starts with the pre-Hispanic cultures, I think that there's a beautiful sense of what really Mexico has always been about, even before the Spanish arrived, which is the layers. And I see beautiful layers every time that you keep developing the book, right? So literally, when we talk about the Spaniards arriving and building on top, and there's a couple of references. I think that you make a reference at the beginning when Diego Guatele was saying they insist in building another one on top of my city. So, and I thought, that's what has always happened, right? So this is something that a lot of people is surprised about, knowing that in pre-Columbian traditions, you will build a temple, and then 52 years later, you build another one.
And that was the Templo Mayor already.
Exactly.
No?
There were 6, 7 already inside. So the notion of building on top is something that was very common, very natural, in the sense of the cycle of time is basically you celebrate the passage of time by making these incredible efforts. When you think about the pyramids, they were getting gigantic every time. Cholula has several pyramids inside, so there's an incredible effort that shows the commitment that they had to do that. So in a way, I think it's interesting when you start reading the city as these layers. You see the pre-Columbian layer, the pre-Hispanic, and then you see the colonial city coming on top, and then you start seeing the modern Mexico. The lake is gone, but you still make reference to Chinampas and the Xochimilco. So you get that very clear sense that when you go to Mexico, and this is one of the things that I try to emphasize with students, literally. I mean, and sometimes you talk symbolically or metaphorically. In this case, it's literally you go and see the layers. You go to the Plaza Mayor and say, "Hey, this is the Templo Mayor," and this was discovered, in the 1970s. But to me, it's very important how all this is part of a story about how Mexico, and that's why I think the title Mexico, even if it's Mexico City, is basically the sense of identity of Mexico and how people think about their history is all very much the connecting aspect of how someone thinks, what is the political climate that in the 1960s basically supports the idea of demolishing these historic colonial buildings to uncover the Templo Mayor. It's a very clear effort of trying to uncover those layers of history. The same way that the archaeologists are excavating the pyramid to see the one that is underneath, to see it better, right? So I think that the layers and in my mind that's sometimes not maybe well explained, that there's more continuity than we tend to think. Yeah. When we think about, the Spanish arrived, and it's like, no, when the Spanish arrive, they see a city that is the perfect layout for a city. When you think about the law of the Indies, they say a plus in the middle, a grid, and they say, and they told Cortés, hey, why don't we build it somewhere else? And he said he was very aware of the symbolic power that it was. No, this is what the prophecy was fulfilled, and this is what we're going to do. It's the center of the world, and it's the center of the world for the Mexica, and it's going to be the center of the world for us, and it's going to be the center of for Mexico. Every time I go to Mexico and I see that gigantic flag in the middle of the Zócalo, no, seriously, I think about that moment where they say, this is it, this is the spot. All ancient cultures needed to find that prophecy, and that is still there. And so there's a sense that layer, those layers are still alive today in a way. And so I think it's fascinating the way you peel off all those layers all the way to a satellite when you think about what it meant. But everything that you said about references to the structure of the city, or the reference are, when you talk about Tosá and the Palacio de la Minería, everything is very, very naturally. Sometimes you feel like in novels when people do some research about something, it feels a little forced. In this case, it feels very natural, and very, very integrated in the narrative, not necessarily, disconnected. So,
and I think that's the risk for many novelists, because you have so much information, you have to put all the information there, and then the novel, it's like a huge Wikipedia about Mexico City, but you already have Wikipedia, so you don't need a novel to do that.
Exactly.
So there are two. Just connecting with Juan was saying, two moments that are I think very interesting for you to know, because they show this in a very clear way. I wanted also to take away some of the stereotypes. So, for example, the Cuautles are the pre-Hispanic. They at some moments are the poorest family in the novel, but they are the ones that are creating a library. And one of them is the Albañil Mayor of the last layers of Catedral, and it's at the same time doing building the new theater. And there, at that moment, they bring a musician from Italy. It's the first time that a musician that it's not from Spanish origin comes to be the master in Catedral, and also the one that will be running the new theater. And this very interesting character allowed me to not only see the city with his eyes, but walk the city. Mm-hmm. So I had to do the same math. Like, for example, from Catedral to the Teatro, the theater doesn't exist now, but, and then there was, he has to stop at some point. Mm-hmm. So where he will stop in the Parian. The Parian doesn't exist now. But, and if he goes into the Parian, and I try to count what type of thinking will he have seeing the city, Ignacio de Jerusalén y Estela, that's the name of the composer, and it's historical composer. And then when he comes into the Parian, I thought, what can he do there? Well, he will drink a champurrado. Mm-hmm. No? And he was drinking the champurrado, and the Albañil Mayor was there drinking a champurrado. And that's the only way they can connect at that point. And he invites him in that same night to Tacubaya for a Afro-Mexican feast with music. And there's some research saying that some of the music of Ignacio de Jerusalén Estela changes a lot when he hears Afro-descendant sounds. We don't know when that happened. Obviously, it could have happened at any time. But I needed that experience of him, a very wealthy elite musician, going into the suburbs, and also I had to research how with horses, how much time you will be making to Tacubaya. So there are many decisions like that. But then at some point, every novelist becomes too crazy. So there's another moment in the novel that you will be very, very, very fond of it. All the chronicles of 1957 of the La Caída del Ángel, the other earthquake, talk about El edificio del Cantinflas, the building of Cantinflas. But I was like, I'm not going to finish this novel until I find the number, and I knew that it was in Insurgentes, but I didn't know the number. And it could have just failed, because even with all my friends and researching and doing a lot of questions, there was no way in no newspaper to find it. And it was logical. At that point, Cantinflas was already like another PRI, almost a politician, but he was a comedian. But he was very, very close to all the politicians. And Ruiz Cortines visits the building, and the building collapsed, but there is no real, because they were protecting Cantinflas. So that's something that only a crazy novelist can.
No, I remember the reference.
You that. So I found
he had 5 floors or something. It was
5 floors, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the only way I could find it, and it was serendipity, I was researching in a memory of foundations, a doctoral thesis of the UNAM, that it's a memory on building foundations in Mexico City. And in a footnote, it appears that foundation was not very founded. So, and then there was the number. So I could write in the chapter. And then in Insurgentes, I don't know the number now, but let's say 3,500, the building of Cantinflas collapsed. And nothing in the novel happens in that building, and it's just a reference. But it becomes something really important. And as a novelist, you become very passionate of those details as being as accurate as possible. And at the same time, I'm going to just circle that. I didn't want this novel to be like Forrest Gump, no, or Selig of Woody Allen, and I have to say, he was a very close friend, but Los Años con Laura Díaz from Carlos Fuentes. That happens that you're saying. The character is always in the perfect moment, in the correct moment, and only knows the moment, the persons that they have to know, so the novelist can write the saga or the history. And I didn't want that to happen, that at some point you will say, oh, now he's going to meet the president. Or, yes, of course, now he's doing this. So all those casual encounters cannot happen every time. They can happen at some point, but they're very rare in real life. So you have to be very, very aware that doesn't happen. So I'm just going to tell another story. There's one of them, for me, one of the probably the best novelists of Mexican history is Manuel Paino. And Paino also wrote a lot of chronicles. And there's a chronicle that it's called The Omnibus to Tacubaya. It happens in a very different time than the Tacubaya that I was mentioning before. And it was a tranvía, but a tranvía of mulitas. It had mules, no? The Omnibus of Tacubaya sounds like the Acela Express, but no, it was really, really slow. So I needed my character to not be able to return to Tacubaya that night. And he's not very wealthy, but he's going to spend the night in the first hotel that was inaugurated very, very briefly before of that night. And he comes into a cafe, and at that point I can tell the history of the cafe and the public sphere that happens on the cafes. And he hears a very wealthy man talking that he has some tickets for the theater, but that he's not going to be able to use it because he's not coming. And they lent the tickets to the Cuautle, to the character that I presented there by casuality. But that can happen once or twice in a novel, or you will be very bored about those encounters. Yeah.
No, it's true that and it is true that it is, people that could take a lot of the novel that they don't necessarily take, like Rivera or Frida. You don't go too deep into that, or for example with Cortés, you make more of a character, his son, than Cortés.
The two Martin Cortéses.
The Martin Cortéses. Which to me this to me is important too, because I think that other thing that is and the way I teach, I try to find the commonalities more than the differences in terms of the way I look at things. And I think it's interesting that when you talk about the different families, it's very obvious that this layering that I'm talking about is the essence of Mexico in a way, right? So the mixing of people. Mm-hmm. So when you think about the la familia Santoveña, the Santoveña family is the Spanish family, but they have indigenous blood, and the Cuautle are also mestizos. Yeah. So the mestizaje is to me a very important aspect, whether it is, you know, even the ones that present themselves as being on this side or that side, in reality there's much more mixing at all levels, and from day one. So when you talk about the Cortés, the son, the first mestizo, and how that becomes, you know, the novel starts practically with that. The notion is that mestizaje started just right away. You know, and Cortés took his son to Spain to present it to the king, to the Pope. So he was very proud of the fact that his son was not, and this sent a message that was very important, because it was not like, I'm going to hide this son that I have. I mean, obviously he gave preference to the other one that came from another wife. But to me, this puts the novel in a context where all these things are much less separated than, you know, what you said. Because at the end of the day, I would say that maybe there were more an emphasis on class. Yeah. When you think about the noble pre-Hispanic families, they kept the privileges. Yeah, they kept the privileges. So class is sometimes more of a separator, even within the Spanish ones. If you were from down here, you don't have any business talking to this one here, even if they were all Spanish, peninsulares. Even when they were peninsulares, they couldn't do it. So I think that comes across very well. Then the idea that this is something very complex, that there, even the notion of how the sense of nationalism and all that was built is always, and in that respect, the one character, probably the one character, if I read the whole thing, if I have to tell you the one character that I wish you could, because it's great, he goes into Humboldt. The Humboldt was fantastic. I didn't know
the story.
No, I didn't know that. So the story, I'm not going to tell all the details, but the way Humboldt makes it into the novel is fantastic, and you know it's very well written, I think. But the one character that I felt like I wish you could have insert more into the discussion is Vasconcelos. Yeah, Vasconcelos as part of that discussion. I will have loved to see a little more what you could have written in relation to that, because it is something that, especially after the revolution, and how that sense of identity. So, and also how it affected the architecture and the muralism and the idea of what architecture should we do after the revolution, which is for architects was a big dilemma. It's like, what should we do? Yeah. You know, do we go more with the pre-Hispanic? Do we go with the colonial? Do we go with the modern? So there's a. Then the Ciudad Universitaria, I think, as a moment in the architectural significant moment in Mexico is also very important. It appears when you think about it, it's 1968, and they were meeting in terms of how, but it's a super important moment, right? So I wonder if you thought about that, Vasconcelos, the mestizaje, the notion of the mestizaje.
I have my own take with Vasconcelos. I have an entire book about, it's called The Failure of the Mestizo. Mm-hmm. And one of the chapters starts saying, José Vasconcelos was a crazy man that believed that he was José Vasconcelos. So I have my own problem with Vasconcelos. No, I mean, it's a scholarly book, but I could have written more about the influence, not Vasconcelos himself, because he became a Nazi. He was founded by the Nazis, and he had a crazy end of life, repenting himself, and he's the only non-saint that is buried in the National Cathedral in Mexico.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his remains are there. Own myth, no?
And he created the own myth of the Raza Cósmica.
And he misquoted him as well.
Mm-hmm. But I have my own problems with Vasconcelos, not with the people that were working with Vasconcelos. Mm-hmm. I always believed that Vasconcelos, for example, never understood Rivera. Mm-hmm. Not only there's this anecdote about the monotes of Rivera, but he really, really understood the politics of Rivera. Mm-hmm. He allowed Rivera to paint, but he was not really fond of what Rivera was doing. Mm-hmm. But then I tried to that decade is very important. I have another book that's cultural history of that era that it's called escribir en México during the crazy years, writing in Mexico during the crazy years, because it's Aaron Copland, musicians, spies, Soviet spies, obviously American spies, British spies, and then shortly after the Spanish Civil War. So I wrote about it, not about architecture or Vasconcelos, but about what happened with the teachers, with the maestros rurales. And there's a character there that is very important. She will marry a Spaniard, but she's a teacher. And she is really, really, she has this idea, this Vasconcelos idea of being like an apostle of education.
Yes,
and changing that belief, that Vasconcelos belief. And that's the character that somehow
connects
goes
with
into
that
that.
idea.
And there's another moment of the novel that his father, of that woman, it's a politician from the PRI or of the PNR first, and Avila Camacho doesn't like him, so he creates like a very, very low position. He goes into a very low position as a judge. But then, and those are the freedoms of a novelist. So I had this character, now he's in a very low position, but he's going to judge the first serial killer in Mexico City, Goyo Cárdenas. So I can now narrate the chapter of Goyo Cárdenas with that character. And then it's like a true crime. A very, very short true crime.
I didn't know about that crime, but I figured it was true.
It's true, and it's incredible because he murdered a lot of girls. He was a chemistry student. He never was sentenced. He defended himself. He studied law, and he finished his life as a public lawyer in California. And he was never sentenced in Mexico for his crimes.
Pablo Picato wrote about
Pablo Picato wrote a little bit about Goyo Cárdenas, yeah. But so at some point I start that chapter saying every city has his serial killer. So now I have the serial killer here, and I have the characters already in place to go into there. Or Ciudad Satélite. I needed the father of my last character of this gay archaeologist needed to be a very, very liberal father. I needed for him to accept when his son comes out of the closet. So
that's
Tonatiuh. So I wanted that Tonatiuh gives the house to his son. But in the house there's this library that I was talking about in La Portales, and there was also the medical practice of Tonatiuh. So he keeps the medical practice, but he goes to live to Ciudad Satélite. So I have Ciudad Satélite at hand, and I can narrate the coming and going in the car and the new development there. But now I have the luxury that this character has a house for himself, where he can really discover not only his sexual inclinations, but his entire political life, and also his idea of what memory and identity means to him, his family, and the entire city.
Yeah.
And then, I'm not going to spoil the novel, but novelists can also have like this Hitchcockian idea of the Maltese Falcon, of the MacGuffin. So there is a MacGuffin in the novel because I needed some common thread, and there's a codex from the family that was the first Tlaquilo painted, the Cuautla Tlaquilo painted, and something's going to happen to that codex, but I'm not going to tell what happens.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I was going to make a reference that I think is a beautiful way for you to, because when you think about a novel of this type of scope, it's like how to start, how to end. It's also a big challenge, right? So how do you decide how to end it? And I think that, I mean, without without spoiling it, I think that the archaeologist character, like you just said, was a very, very nice way for you to connect with how the book starts in ways that makes reflections that are related to the entire novel. But I wanted to mention something that I think is important. The last comment that I have, and then we can open to.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to that connection with the reflections of Leonardo at the end are very connected to this idea of the force of nature, the earthquake, right? And I think that's something that all ancient people, people from antiquity all over the world, this is not uncommon to, pre-Hispanic people, they were afraid of the wrath of nature. And they built things to protect themselves against that. And so what they built, that's one of the things that I like in architecture, is that what they did was very clearly geared towards that kind of relationship that is very strong with nature. Now with the global climate change and all that, we are realizing, it looks like we can affect nature, and nature can make us pay. We are back to where we were at that time. We're realizing, if we mess with nature, nature is going to give us back something that we cannot control. We think that we have the ability to control everything, but we cannot control nature. And I think that that's a beautiful way for the connection with the city and what they build, the Altepetl, because you start with Altepetl as the word for city, is literally water mountain.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's basically saying the city is only possible because of the water mountain. So it's a linkage between city and nature that we lost, and now we're realizing we better connect it again. So that's one of the lessons from pre-Columbian cultures. It's like they were telling us something in their own belief system that is very much exactly what we need to do now, which is we need to respect nature, because otherwise we're going to be in trouble. And I think it's a very nice way that you connected that.
Yeah.
I wonder if the audience have questions, comments. We have some, I guess, what time do we finish, Paloma?
1:45.
Yeah, I mean.
So if you allow me just to, before the conversation opens, just to read, it's in Spanish, but I'm going to read just 2 moments of that ending, because most of us here are teachers, or we teach, or we go into that idea. So the character is this archaeologist, and he's teaching a lesson in the Escuela Nacional de Antropología. And it's the first day of class, but it's also the day of the earthquake. So, I mean, it's a long lesson, but I'm just going to read some parts so you can have a sense of what Juan was saying, and why I believe that all good novels have a theory of the novel within the novel. But in this case, I was eager to present it, not only to disseminate it during the novel, but present the theory of the novel within the pages of the novel. And
is this the 57 earthquake? Or
no, this is 85. This is 85.
The 57.
And he's already working in the Templo Mayor.
Okay.
In his afternoons, and he's teaching in the mornings in Copilco. So he's saying it's the narrator, but it's in his point of view. Es el primer día de clases, de nuevo. La Escuela Nacional de Antropología e Historia es otra casa, otra generación de aspirantes. La mayoría se quedará en las aulas, piensa, mientras mira sus rostros. Muy pocos llegarán a titularse, menos a ejercer. Este país se ha ido desdibujando en cada crisis, envuelto en su propio fango de corrupción e impunidad. Hace frío, es muy temprano. Siempre le ha gustado dar clases a esa hora. La mayoría de los alumnos están dormidos. Pero la ciudad apenas se mueve, no hay ruido. La ciudad que tanto ha amado, la ciudad de los palacios, que se ha vuelto la de los ejes viales y la del asfalto, la impersonal a la que le han arrasado los árboles, la ciudad de la que no se iría nunca. La ciudad es su verdadero amante, la camina, la disfruta, sigue envuelta en misterio, ignota a pesar de ser tan vista. Hay 26 alumnos, los cuenta mientras camina al escritorio donde deposita un altero de libros. Sabe que es mejor asustarlos el primer día. Claro que su fama lo precede y solo unos cuantos se atreven a inscribirse a sus clases. No sabe si le tienen miedo por el rigor o por los últimos paseos por la ciudad. No se aprende arqueología en un pupitre, les dice siempre, sino excavando, o yendo con ellos a la Ciudad de México. Mira al frente del salón, le gusta enfocarse en una o dos caras, lo tiene bien aprendido. Así se pierde el miedo escénico, aún después de tantos años. Leonardo Cuautle, uno de los primeros que excavaron el Templo Mayor, eso los atrae siempre, al menos a los osados. Hay uno en particular en la segunda fila, lentes, pelo largo, fuma. Varios fuman en clase. Esto ya es arqueología misma, ¿no? Pero ustedes se acuerdan de las clases, quienes
claro,
acuerdan.
todos fumamos.
Él mismo en un rato seguro encenderá uno de sus cigarrillos, delicados sin filtro siempre. El humo llenará el salón como si fuera niebla. Les pedirá que se presenten, le gusta dirigirse a cada uno por su nombre desde el inicio, y su memoria es infalible, su mejor cualidad. Pero ahora primero tiene que atraparlos para siempre. Como le dijo hace años una de sus discípulas, eres un encantador de serpientes. Eso, ser el apellido, pensó entonces, sin atreverse al chiste insulso de recordarles que Cuautle viene no de serpiente, sino de Cuautli, águila. Y ahora sí ya viene la parte que me interesa. Le pregunto a los alumnos, ¿por qué nos fascinan las ruinas? La clase se sumerge en un silencio unánime. Si podemos responder esta pregunta, empezaremos bien el semestre. Piensen. Ahora sí los mira. ¿Quiénes son? Cada uno de ellos lo miran. Uno de sus alumnos, moreno, delgado, casi un adolescente, baja la vista apenado. Para ver cómo vivían nuestros antepasados, se atreve una alumna a responder. Tiene un cuaderno abierto en blanco y plumas de varios colores con las que seguramente piensa atrapar la sabiduría de su profesor. Leonardo no responde inicialmente, al contrario, lo sigue contemplando inquisitivamente. Más que miedo, sintió escepticismo en el salón. Las ruinas nos hablan, son verdaderas, buscamos la verdad del pasado, dice el alumno de pelo largo que se ha sentado en la última fila y fuma con displicencia. Solo entonces les dice que por favor digan su nombre antes de hablar, así que nos vamos conociendo. Los hechos, dice a brote pronto sin pensar. ¿Hechos? Es Cuautle contestando. ¿Y quién determina cuáles hechos son relevantes? ¿De quién es la historia? Casi siempre es masculina, por ejemplo con los mexicas. Es una historia casi exclusivamente militar. ¿Y ellas? ¿Dónde están los hechos que les atañen a ustedes, compañeras? Mira a las estudiantes una a una. Los hechos solo nos dicen lo que ha pasado. Las piedras igual. Pestes, guerra, muerte. La historia descansa en las grietas, en las fisuras, en los pliegues. La verdadera pregunta se hace siempre en condicional. ¿Qué hubiese pasado si? Necesitamos eliminar de nuestro estudio del pasado la idea de inevitabilidad. ¿De dónde nos viene esa lectura teleológica? Vuelve a hacerse el silencio. El joven tímido que había bajado la vista al inicio se atreve. Soy Raimundo, profesor. ¿Será la idea de causalidad? Bien, de acuerdo. La historia no obedece a las leyes de la física, como que a toda acción le corresponde una reacción. Esto es efecto inevitable de una causa. Alguien más se atreve. Nos hablan de algo majestuoso, nos revelan misterios. Son instantáneas, es cierto, de aquello que ocurrió antes. Por ejemplo, Pompeya. Coloca un acetato alusivo en el retroproyector. Nos hablan de aquello que existía antes de la catástrofe, la explosión del Vesubio que los sepultó a todos. Pero al abrir y limpiar un vestigio arqueológico, contribuimos a su destrucción. Miren estas imágenes. Una bañera, lo que seguramente era la cocina de una casa, nos sugieren no una épica majestuosa, sino la vida cotidiana de quienes nunca pensaron ser sujetos de estudio de ninguno de ustedes. El pasado estaba enterrado y ustedes son los antisepultureros. Todo arqueólogo es un profanador de tumbas. Perpetuamente molestamos, perturbamos ese pasado que yace enterrado. Cambia las imágenes, esta vez son de la cultura maya, la tumba de Pacal. ¿Qué les dicen estas imágenes? Además de la opulencia, ¿qué les revelan? Ahora el silencio es más denso, es un silencio que podría palparse. El silencio del salón de clases de Leonardo Cuautle Luján ha adquirido textura y raspa, rugoso como la piel de una toronja. Enciende un cigarrillo, echa humo, mira a sus alumnos nuevamente. Jacques Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, en sus Études de la Nature de 1784, fue el primero en hablar del placer de las ruinas. Está hablando de una visita a Dresden en 1765, 5 años después del bombardeo prusiano. Miren esta imagen. El acetato muestra un grabado de Bernardo Bellotto, una imagen del mismo año de la visita de Saint-Pierre. Según él, continúa Leonardo, nuestro placer aumenta si estas estructuras ruinosas fueron originalmente sitios de crímenes o tiranías. Pero deténganse en las palabras que he usado ya varias veces. Placer. ¿Por qué nos fascinan las ruinas? Morbo, dice Julián, el joven del pelo largo. Exacto. Digamos que nos satisface ese género que podríamos llamar porno ruina. Esa es la porno ruina.
Si tienen algún comentario, alguna pregunta, aunque no hayan leído la novela, pero han visitado la Ciudad de México, entonces I just switched to Spanish, right?
Because of the reading.
So,
There's a question there.
sí, Matthew.
Oh, yeah. You talked there at the beginning about how you chose the families that were going to create an attachment to your book. I was wondering about the selection of spaces and places in Mexico City. Mexico City always has an impression of being a city of cities. There are barriers and neighborhoods, and everyone's city is different. So how did you choose those places? Are there places that to you are Mexico City. And then another question, if there's time, is about other novels that claim to be a novel of Mexico City,
Yeah.
or like the Legacy Más Transparente.
Yeah.
Dialogue with those, you incorporate those books in your novel.
So the first question, yeah. I
Matthew,
think,
by the way, is a historian of Mexico.
from Mexico. Oh, nice meeting you. So the first question is very interesting because I always say the same, that Mexico City is a city of cities. And then within that city you have even local regions from Mexico that not only arrive, but they live in part of the city. So you have the Oaxaca in Mexico City, or the Oaxaqueños, or the Juquilas, and you have people from other places in other moments. No, so yes, it's this. I try to go into many other places than the Centro Histórico, and this also ties to some of the comments of Juan that I already wrote like 50 pages of the novel and I was stuck, and then I read a book that I recommend you to read better than my novel, that it's called The Death of Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico, of a Canadian archaeologist, Barbara Mundi. And reading Barbara Mundi, I discovered with Barbara that this thing that Juan was saying, that the novels kept not only their places but their houses. So the family of Moctezuma lived very close to the Templo Mayor. They were married, the women were married with the Spanish capitans, and so that allows me to go into not only the Altepec but also the parcialidades, Moyopan, and then starting to talk about barrios or neighborhoods, but very early on in the novel. And then it's very different to live, as I said, Tacubaya is very important in the novel because many things happen in Tacubaya. One of the plaques, the most important plaques, happened in Tacubaya, and it was like blamed to those people, but now we know that it came from Orizaba, and it was not to be blamed of the people of Tacubaya. But then there's obviously other places, no? Coyoacán, and then La Portales, and then many other small, even the description of a small street, or some crimes that happened because that street was not covered, or covered by police or protected. So at some point, I thought, okay, it's impossible to write the history of Mexico City in a novel that happens within the framework of 500 years, and then also trying to go all the way to all the barrios. So because I was doing also the linguistic research with the Mexican tradition, and that will allow me to answer your second question. I was discovering, like for example, the literatura de la Honda was not really the literatura of Mexico City. It was from the Narvarte and la del Valle. So all the novels happen in two small neighborhoods of Mexico City, and the idiolect, the sociolect that they talk was just from them. But no one was speaking like that in Iztapalapa or Ciudad Neza. So that brings me to your own second question, the idea that obviously the first and the most important Mexico City novel is La Región Más Transparente. And it's also a very ambitious novel that in a short period of time everything happens, because Fuentes was developing at that moment this idea that he talks about in Tiempo Mexicano, that it comes from Faulkner, but no matter from where it comes, it was very potent for his own writing, that in any moment in Mexico, all historical moments have their saying, and there's a confluence of the past, the present, and the future. It comes from Faulkner, but he develops this in Tiempo Mexicano, and in another very interesting essay that it's called From Quetzalcoatl to Pepsicoatl, from the same time. But the thing that I didn't want it to happen with this novel, that happens with some of the novels from Fuentes and from the other writers from that moment, is that at the end there's like a allegorical explanation. All these things that happen to the characters happens because we're Mexican, and I think it's an internal flaw, that believing that maybe it's the only literature that it's so densely informed by identity that if a character has prostate cancer, it's because it's a Mayan. Something happened. He mixed up with Chacmol, no? and in any other literature, you have prostate cancer and you go to the doctor and you get a surgery, and it will happen something with your sexuality or whatever, but you don't have the allegory. So this is a novel of identity, obviously, but I didn't want to have that like teleological explanation that somehow will flaw the main idea of the novel is that there are daily lives of people here that could happen in any other city, but this city informs how they live the city, they live their lives. And I believe also that, and I think it's something really important in Mexico City that doesn't happen in many cities, at least it doesn't happen in any other city in Mexico. That even with all the problems, it's more democratic than any other city in Mexico. You can really encounter people from many other classes, have many interactions that won't happen in any other place. And because it's a city of migrants forever, it's a city that receives you very well. So you hear stories of people that saying, I came to Mexico City and it was my second chance, my third chance. Then finally I developed a family. That couldn't happen in Zapopan or in Puebla. So in Puebla, if you go to Puebla, it's very rare that someone is going to invite you to his house, no? Unless it's Adela.
But I am half the one. So.
But it's half Oaxaqueña, yeah. So. And in Mexico City, things happen in houses. People, once they get to know you, they will invite you to their house. That's for sure. And it doesn't happen in many European cities also. You will have your appointments in a coffee, even with friends, but not in a house. So that's very special of Mexico City. It's a very welcoming place. Even with the violence or whatever, it's very welcoming.
Can I say something about Matthew's second question? I think the publishing of La Región Más Transparente is a watershed in the novels about Mexico City. Because there is this ambitious desire of thinking lo mexicano from the perspective of past, but also doing the layout of a very complex city in terms of time and space. And that is the watershed of when like Fuentes becomes more experimental. Because it is very difficult to write a novela total, you know, and then after that novel is very interesting. The novels that are published on Mexico City are going to be novels about barrios, El Vampiro de la Colonia Roma, you know, and it's about subcultures, right? The gay subculture, or Gazapo, you know, the youth, not only Jose Agustin, but those of like, or novels about, youth or childhood, like Las Batallas en el Desierto by José Emilio Pacheco.
And then 20 years after, there is a novel that it's called El Blues del Chavo Banda, that it's Eduardo Villegas editing his boy, and it's about Iztapalapa.
Yeah, or Tepito, right?
Just Iztapalapa, or Chinchin el Teporocho.
Chinchin el Teporocho, right? Like a novel about Tepito. But it's very interesting, Pedro, how you manage to overcome that threshold that, like, La Región Más Transparente put, like the idea that it was going to be very difficult to write a novel that could be holistic or comprehensive. And it was very interesting the way you started talking about that challenge of like how to bridge linguistically the diachronic and synchronic axes that are a city.
So what I do also here is I do two jokes that I forgot. The characters at some point are reading La Región Más Transparente, and then one names his son Ixcacuautle for Ixca Cienfuegos. So there's a homage there, of course, no? Yeah.
So any comment or question?
I have a question. Besides the reference you made about the massacre of the students in 1968, have you approached the violence, the legacies of violence, or brutality in Mexico City?
So what I tried to do is that after 1968, the next moment of brutality are what they were called the redadas for the gays of Uruchurto, the regente de la Ciudad de México, started making raids in all the gay bars. And that's the next step of not recognizing difference, political violence within a group. So I go into the 70s thinking on minorities, especially gay minorities, and what happened to them at the time. But coming back, there was another decision right in 1968 that it's not as similar as the one that I mentioned about the Decena Trágica in 1914. But I also thought, okay, Tlatelolco and the massacre is already a genre. I will also say that everything that we say about 68 is very, very heavily based upon the literature that was written about 68. So there's not another moment in Mexican history where everything that we think or thought or discover, it's based on Elena Poniatowska, on Luis González de Alba. So what I thought is, what if I go into the oral history and I just take away all the testimonios on the Noche de Tlatelolco, and I go to direct oral testimony of people that are not well known, that were in Tlatelolco at the moment, and then, so that was my research for the chapter. Having read, and even I taught 2 semesters at class on the literature of Tlatelolco. I said, okay, no, I don't want to read anything from that literary perspective. I want oral history. But at the same time, and that's where the Cuartel de la Portales is very important. Everything is going to be written when the survivors come in the night to the Cuartel. And it's going to be written with the immediacy of what happened to me, what happened to my mother, or to my cousin, or one of the characters, for example, was, and it's a real, everything in that chapter is very, very close to oral history. So one of my characters has to stay below a corpse for 2 hours so the soldiers don't discover him. And when the soldiers leave, he sneaks out. It's a story that everything is referenced in my bibliographical essay at the end. But what I tried to do there is that these are young people. They're 18, 19. They have discovered death and violence in their bodies, in the bodies of their classmates, an hour ago. How they will write and think about it. They don't have the luxury of what we have already discovered about 68 or how it was written in literary texts. They're just young people that have experienced the utmost violence in their bodies, as I said, 2 hours before. So it's with that sense of immediacy that I write that chapter, because it will change the life of all of them, and it will change the city forever. So that's why I end the novel in 1985, because I think that 85 is the end of the political system that created modern Mexico. And I also have, with that chapter, the luxury of talking about the hopes of the different people that are not within the system. For example, Barco Rascón, Super Barrio, all the things that were done with the costureras and with the vecindades in the historical center. So I talk a lot about this. And the character, the archaeologist, says at some point, stones don't matter, what matters is people. So he takes his own hat from the Templo Mayor and he starts digging corpses and survivors from the ruins. Not the ruins that he's studying, but the ruins of 1985 and what's happening.
But
again.
I wonder if you made a connection between the archaeology findings and the ethno-archaeology regarding the bloody rituals or sacrifices, pre-Hispanic, and then the conquest, and then so many layers of
violence,
of violence in Mexico City, in the same place, but in layers, like in the Plaza de Tres Culturas.
There are 2 questions with Paloma, Rico, and
Richard.
Well, I'm not sure if the novel covers the history and use of the Zócalo through the years. I have always been very intrigued by the Zócalo's public space because I assume it was built before the colonizers. is very different from Plaza de Armas and other places where they are in the center next to the government buildings, but they have benches and trees. So there's social gathering, but no political gathering.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering when it was built, they had that in mind. This will be used one day to protest authority, and people will bring tents and will spend the night, will be cookouts. how the use of the Zócalo has evolved through the years.
Yeah, and there's a lot in the novel about that, because we really have had a very normal Plaza de Armas with a kiosco in the middle and trees and everything. Yeah, and then the name Zócalo comes from one of the first rebuildings of the Plaza Mayor done by Santana. But as you know, Santana was a doomed character at the end, so he didn't finish his own statue. And the only thing that remained was the Zócalo, where the statue was going to be put. And there's a recent now with this artificial intelligence things. They I think 2 weeks ago, that someone recreated what would have happened if the Santana, yeah, we would have 15 uñas there in the center of Mexico. See, that would be possible, but yes, of course. And then the recent development with the huge that was all that was done because of the desfiles. Was like a civic, almost Soviet idea of the desfiles
became
with
a place
Echeverría.
for strikes.
Yeah, that's interesting because it was not intended to that. It was to show the military. We had a soft dictatorship, even if someone don't accept that. But yeah, especially with Echeverría.
But there's a character that complains about the name, right? I forgot who that was, but there's a character that didn't like the name Zócalo. It's like, why that? Plaza de Armas. So it was called Plaza de Armas. And even in the late 90s, I think there were still competitions for architects that tried to rethink the Zócalo, and there was one winning team. The Zócalo, like putting trees, and they had. I think the winning team had this beautiful jacaranda, and then they decided not to do anything. It's just too complicated. I think that they just gave up. I don't know if there's going to be another government that comes say, hey, let's do something with the Zócalo that can bring back some of the other things that used to be part of it.
And there was the government, but also the Portal de Mercaderes, where everything was sold, and then. But the real paseo was always La Alameda. It wasn't never the Plaza de Armas. That was always like more civic and commercial. But the real paseo was the Alameda. And the other thing is that we have to take into account, and I try to be very explicit in terms of description, that it was really, really a city on a lake, that the houses had two entrances, one in which you were in your canoa and the other where you go into for the land. And then how a city like that, how it smelled. Because the first real civic reconstruction of the city is with the Segundo Virrey, because he thinks this is just a chaos. People throw their feces in the street. There is all this smell that is coming from the canal. So at some point, all that I think it's somehow told in the novel. But it's because something. What I think I learned writing so many historical novels is that if these things don't happen to the characters, it won't matter, even if you're very, very accurate or you try to do all this minutiae. It has to have some consequence for the characters. For example, the first flooding of Mexico City, the Santoveña leave the city. They go to Zacatecas to their mines, and they give the house to the Inquisition. And it's obviously it's a poetic license, but that's the real house of the Inquisition. And it was given by another family, a real other family that were miners that really existed, but my family is obviously fictitious.
Thank you. I was thinking a lot about the archaeological elements and the layering, and it reminds me of Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, where he invites the reader to think about Rome in terms of all of these layers. And the collection of which form a kind of a psychological space. And it's not fully conscious, you know. So you're walking by where the Inquisition took place, and most people, including people from Mexico City, may have no idea of the historical context, but the argument is that that context is seeping in
always,
and affecting our subjectivity, our experience of the place. So I can't wait to read your novel.
Oh, thank you. So one of the things that happened that I didn't obviously plan or intended is that the publisher, the marketing team of the publisher decided to promote the novel for the first time in a Mexican novel with a tour. So we put in a bus all the people from the press, not only written press but television, radio. So we took them into a bus, and we landed in some of the places that happen in the novel. But then I'm not a tourist guide, but they wanted me to do something like that. So I tried to talk about the place and the characters. They hadn't read the novel at the moment, but how the characters. And then the interesting thing that happened is that people thought that I was. So they recorded me with their cell phones. And they wanted to take pictures with me, but I was like in the front of Monte de Piedad talking about what happened there and the Palacio de Axayácatl and all because that's one of the architectural landmarks that you can see the past in the stones, no? And then we went into the Hospital de Jesus to see the remains of Hernán Cortés, that not many Mexicans, as you said, know where they are. If they know, probably they will just destroy the Hospital de Jesus, destroy the remains of Cortés. So there's always ambivalence to that character in Mexican history. But it was a very interesting thing because most of those journalists didn't know where things were. And they're from the cultural sections, no? They're not like political journalists, but they didn't know many of the things.
But I think like Ricardo, who is actually writing a book on Freud, correct? You are writing a book. How is it that spaces have this aura of the past? And when you enter a space without knowing what happened there is something that triggers some unconscious deep layer, and in that sense the metaphor of archaeology comes to the fore. And
that subconscious, or at least that subjectivity, comes into the forefront, because of I think so. But in Mexico City, the thing is that how that relates to your own family or your own story. So one of the things that happened that it's very close to your question is that people, because it's not a novel of characters, and that's something that worried me a lot. Who's going to read a novel of 500 pages where the main character dies in the second page? You're already knowing, what's going to happen to the sister of God? Oh, she's dead. And then once finally you discover there is a lineage, you can somehow relate with the normal things that happen in a novel, suspense or a character arc or whatever. And here, the character arc is related to family. So what's happening is that, and I think that's the way that many people read subconsciously a city, is that they relate to the history of their families in that city. Oh yes, my grandmother came in a very similar fashion, and there's this very relatable steps that happened. And they most of the times don't know why those things happened. It's not historical. It's epidermical. That's where my grandmother used to eat guajolotas with her tamales when she came from Michoacán. Things that are very... So it's maybe subconscious, but it comes from the epidermical contact with daily things that happen in the city. Or this is where my grandfather was robbed at some point, or assaulted, or...
Richard?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really sorry for dropping in late, but I can't wait to read your novel. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Mexican American Studies, and I'm captured by actually the novels that aren't written around yours. because there is that sort of work of selection that has to take place in order to make that novel sort of take form. And the one that really kind of jumped out at me was, or one of these sort of possibilities, is this idea of a greater Mexico.
Yeah.
Right. That I find sort of implicitly articulated in, say, the first chapter of El Laberinto de la Soledad, right? That it's all based on Los Angeles, you know, the second largest Mexican city out in the world, right?
Yeah.
And likewise, Los Angeles is a city built on sand, you know, and subject to shaking and getting sacudida, no?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it seems that what would a novel about a greater Mexico along that trajectory, what might it look like? And you know, I guess I'm soliciting your speculation.
So I didn't pay Richard for this question, so I can answer. So I can answer because I'm writing that novel now. So I'm writing a novel about Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor of California, that was also Afro-descendant. But also I'm already almost done with the initial research. So I'm incorporating all the testimonials from Apolinaria Lorenzana and all the women that were orphans. California was somehow populated very similarly to Australia. So prisoners, Afro-descendants, orphans, all were sent there. Prisoners of war. And there's this proud sense of people that believed they were Californians. They were not really Mexicans, but they had this very strong connection to Mexico. And Pio Pico in particular is very interesting for me because he did this secularization of the missions almost 50 years before Benito Juárez in Mexico.
Wow.
So he was a real liberal. He decided, and he got a lot of opposition, obviously, of the wealthy families of California. And California had, at that moment, this very, very clear division between the Northerners, people that were in Monterey Bay, and the Southerners. And that's why Pio Pico changed everything to Los Angeles, because he was a Southerner. But he couldn't become what he became with his racial heritage and with his poverty if he didn't marry a woman from one of the wealthiest families of the North. So it's a family history. It's a greater Mexican history because he fought Manuel Victoria, the brother of Guadalupe Victoria, that was sent. Guadalupe Victoria was sent as the first governor of Mexican California, and the Californians fought against him because he didn't know anything about California.
And then becomes the first president.
Yeah. So I'm writing already that novel, and I'm really excited about what's going to happen because it's a very different novel also.
Okay, so we have time to two more questions. I guess Gael. Okay, why don't we take the three questions or the questions and then you can answer succinctly.
Together. Okay.
So Gael, Alex, Jefferson, somebody else? No? Okay. Yeah? Okay.
Well, I'm going to move to Spanish. Pedro, te quiero preguntar, en un momento en donde todo lo que parece estarse escribiendo son fragmentos, ¿no? El testimonio, hay una vuelta al testimonio, al fragmento, donde la ciudad no aparece. Yo en realidad celebro muchísimo lo que haces, esa persistencia por continuar con lo que empezó en el crack, que era la idea de novela total. Y mi pregunta tiene un poco que ver, más que una pregunta es pues expandir un poco sobre la teoría de la novela, que algo mencionaste. ¿Cuál es la importancia como intelectual y escritor mexicano que vive en el extranjero de continuar esta postura, ¿no? de seguir con esta idea de la novela como totalidad?
Alex?
I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but I'm going to wait until I get to Mexico City this summer to read it.
That's a good idea, yeah.
But I have a question that's actually a little bit related, but more about the historical novel. In Mexico, there's been a long history of the historical novel as kind of an offshoot of the state, as a way to congeal notions of the state to kind of sort of create a notion of false cohesion. But there's also been historical novels like Elena Poniatowska's, which have deconstructed the state along questions of race, gender, sexuality. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you see your novel's relation with the nation state and how you see it in the larger history of the historical novel within Mexico.
Great questions.
Sí, ahora decías que la novela no es una novela de caracteres, no es una novela de personajes, digamos, pero una de las grandes, no críticas, pero de los riesgos que se corre al escribir novela histórica, que se lo han señalado, por ejemplo, Germán Espinosa en Colombia, y es el hecho de que construyes como un background histórico, pero luego los personajes un poco quedan diluidos, ¿no? No tienen quizá como la profundidad psicológica, digamos, son personajes muy interesantes, y ahora decía usted que uno de ellos muere en la segunda página, pero sí me interesa saber cómo enfrentó esa dificultad, o si la enfrentó, o cuál fue la decisión que tomó frente a el background histórico y luego a la construcción de los personajes.
¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿No? Ok.
Pues no sé si puedo responder sucintamente, como dice, a las tres a la vez.
Si pudieses hacer 500 páginas de novela, seguro que
yo creo que no puedes regresar al tipo de novela total que pretendíamos al principio del crack, que era una especie de regreso al boom, que respondía a un momento también histórico y editorial muy particular de las novelas en español. Se estaban escribiendo novelas para ser publicadas en España con determinadas características, y Alfaguara tenía mucho que ver con esta alfaguarización que le decíamos de la literatura, ¿no? Incluso grandes amigos nuestros, ¿no? Daniel Sada, Carmen Boullo, estaban escribiendo estas pequeñísimas novelas que eran como breves tratados de la mexicanidad para que se leyeran en España y que era lo único que pasaba. Lo que pasa es que con los años siguientes vino una relectura de lo latinoamericano a través de los cárteles y de la violencia, que hizo que se empezara solo a leer la literatura que se escribía en América Latina, que ya no era realismo mágico, sino que solo tenía que ver con la violencia. Y a eso se le han cruzado obviamente otros géneros. Uno de ellos es la autoficción, otra es la literatura, digamos, fragmentaria, en los que yo personalmente no creo, pero hay muy buena gente que hace autoficción y que lo hace muy bien y que yo los respeto. No los leo mucho porque no me gusta mucho la exhibición del escritor en las páginas. No somos gente muy interesante, entonces ¿para qué vamos a leer la vida del escritor? Puede que de pronto haya alguien que sea un genio, pero en general son bastante autorreflexivas esas novelas, y ya nosotros tuvimos buena dosis de novela autorreflexiva con la literatura de la onda como para seguir haciendo novela autorreflexiva, en mi juicio. Entonces, ¿qué puedes hacer con una novela total hoy en día? No es esta pretensión de explicación teleológica, alegórica, de la que hablaba, de esa otra novela total que iba a decirlo todo, pero antes de la novela total latinoamericana hubo grandes novelas que ya plantean otra totalización de la realidad. Adán Buenos Aires, por ejemplo, ¿no? Que para mí es un modelo de novela de ciudad, ¿no? Que no es Dos Pasos, no es La región más transparente, es una novela que juega con los distintos cambios de punto de vista. Entonces creo que por allí hay algo interesante que lo puedo ligar. I can tie that to the idea of changing or challenging some of the historical novels that somehow relate to a state. But they're not the most important. Like, for example, all the episodios nacionales that we had, like Galdós with Victoriano Salado Álvarez in Mexico. But there was always a counter historical novel. Some of the best novels of the revolution are counter historical already. Nelly Campobello, or even Rulfo. And then the problem with all types of novels in Mexico is that there happened someone that we have to go back again and again, that it's not so read now, and it's a shame, that it's Jorge Ibargüengoitia. So Jorge Ibargüengoitia decided, this is the novel of the revolution, I'm going to just write the last novel of the revolution, so no one can write a novel of the revolution again. And he wrote a novel about the memory of a general, and no one can write after that a novel of the revolution without being critical. And then the novel of the dictator, Matarás al León, and no one can write a novel of the dictator after. And then a novel about independence, Los Pasos de López, and no one can write a novel about that. It's a shame that he died so young, but maybe he would be mocking every other writer, or even...
He died in the same airplane crash that...
Ángel Rama, Marta Traba, and Manuel Escorza, Peruvian writer. So, but yeah, there are many other instances in which, and for many years I said to journalists and in interviews that I don't write really historical novels. I write what I call documental fiction. So historical novels, some of them happen what Jefferson was saying. There's somehow a depiction of an era, characters are not important. Sometimes there's not even a very strong plot. And some of those novels, not all, but some of those novels are escapist exercises where there's, for example, a lot of revisionism, historical revisionism that I just don't like. So I write historical novels because I'm concerned about the present, and I'm concerned about what happened in the present that didn't respond in past times to the historical and social forces of the moment. So why we didn't went into this side that probably was the best one, and we embraced this other, like Porfiriato, for example. We embraced another moment that came from France and we didn't take into account all the regional decisions and political movements that were already taking place in Mexico. We had like 25, 26 indigenous uprisings within the period. And no one only talks probably about Tomochic. But there was even a bigger one in Chiapas with Pedro Díaz-Cuscat trying to make an independence of the Tzotzil people. And so some of those regional things never happened because we took a stand and we changed or we veered into another direction. And that's some of the things that I really think about why I write about historical novels. So, and just trying to tie that to the end, it's very difficult for a writer that said that to say that he or she succeeded in the enterprise. So you have to read the novel Jefferson to say, okay, this guy didn't really did a good job, and the characters are not sufficiently psychologically created or whatever. But I think that at some point, this novel also, specifically this novel, tries to challenge the idea of a reader that just takes into account an individual life as an important life, and that it's because of that individual that all the other lives turn around. So this is more like a novel of casting. So I'm a casting director more than a writer. And with casting, and probably the best example of good casting in recent era is Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is not a series of characters. We have obviously Walter White and we have Jesse, and but it's really a novel of psychology, but of a cast. And what you do with a cast is that characters have to be so different that all the decisions and choices from the cast affect each of the others, more in a constellation way. And here you have the luxury, at least from my perspective as a novelist, that you have the lineage. So what happened to a family is really more interesting than what happens just to one of the characters. So one of the things that I think the novel creates is a sense of continuity, as one was saying, more historical continuity. This family has been facing all these challenges all this time for 500 years, or 80 years if you're the Jewish family, but also a lot of the things that happen here in Mexico where you're living are related to history, and because you live in La Merced, and then probably your family is one of the families that kept the costureras locked. And as you know, in the earthquake, those buildings collapsed with the costureras locked and they couldn't escape. So everything somehow ties together in a city.
I'm sorry to tell you, but esto se acabó.